So now it is my immense pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Gerald FitzGerald, who serves as an adjunct faculty member of politics and government in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Um, so beyond thrilled to have Gerald here with us today. His expertise centers on state-minority religion relations, which explains why he's addressing this particular topic today. Dr. FitzGerald's doctoral dissertation work focused on comparative historical state-religion relations in Western Europe, with an emphasis on engagement with Jewish and Muslim minorities in the present day. His current interests include the interface between academia and policy at the intersection of religion and international affairs. He recently completed a 3-year term as a senior consultant to the British Council, where he managed the flagship Bridging Voices program. And we are so very fortunate to have him here with us today. As I mentioned, he has generously offered to provide his email and is able to answer questions after the event for any questions that we're unable to answer live. I also have a link here to his website. On the website, you will be able to access the report. We will also share the report and a link to the report in the follow-up email. But if you're eager to get to it now, you can click on the link on his website and you will find it there. And so briefly, before I pass things off to Dr. FitzGerald, I will just mention that we're going to start the session with an overview from him. I really wanted to give the bulk of this webinar, give him the space to present on the research findings that are in this incredible, really, truly groundbreaking report. We'll follow that with some questions. I'm going to ask a few questions first to kick it off, and then we would be happy to answer as many questions as we collect during the webinar in the Q&A section. So feel free to enter them at any time. We will be following those and doing our best to respond to them when he finishes his overview. So without further ado, Dr. FitzGerald, I am going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Martha, for your introduction. I'm delighted for the opportunity to share this research with this audience today. Martha has already given you some background on my path to this work. I'm a political scientist by training. My dissertation, as Martha mentioned, was on Muslim and Jewish community organizations and their historical engagements with governments in the UK, France, and the Netherlands. So this particular project kind of married my interests in religiously motivated discrimination on the one hand, and disinformation and more broadly the crisis of public communications on the other hand. So let me start by providing sort of a brief roadmap to the presentation today. First, I'll speak to the research process involved in the project. Then I'll talk about the actors involved in these information manipulation campaigns, their strategies and techniques. I'll speak briefly about how they weaponize government by targeting like-minded or susceptible politicians. And finally, I'll talk about the implications for funders and our recommendations for those in the philanthropic sector. So the research that we conducted last year focused on cycles of manipulated information that have targeted US-based Muslim-led humanitarian relief organizations. Today, I'm going to provide a succinct roadmap of how these cycles are created and perpetuated in the public sphere and what the broader implications might be for funders. In our methodology, we used structured online searches that co-located the names of 9 largest US-based Muslim-led humanitarian relief organizations with words such as extremism, terror, terrorism, designated, etc. So we then assessed the content that these searches produced to sort of separate benign results from disinformation, and ultimately to identify a number of different types of actors operating in this space. Some of these were state actors, but that was actually not really the focus of our report. Our focus was on US-based non-state actors who produce, disseminate, and legitimate this manipulated information about American Muslim charities. We identify basically 3 different categories of actors. First, generators are self-described activist think tanks or activists working in certain corners of the countering violent extremism or CVE space. The second group of actors were what we call disseminators. These are sort of sympathetic media outlets GONGOs, which are government organized NGOs, or in other words, organizations that presented as NGOs, but are in reality somehow connected to foreign governments, usually intelligence services. And the previously mentioned activist think tanks, also some academics in CVE space. And here I should actually note that some of the generators of this manipulated information also are involved in disseminating it. In other words, organizations like activist think tanks will generate the content, and then they will also sort of publish it on their websites and sort of syndicate it across various media spaces. And the final actor that we looked at are what we call legitimators. These are think tanks, NGOs, individuals from think tanks, NGOs, etc., who validate the weaponized narratives in policy or political spaces. In other words, they show up at hearings or investigations on Capitol Hill, and they lend legitimacy to the manipulated information. So here I'll talk briefly about some of the organizational strategies deployed by the generators of manipulated information. One common strategy is presenting an information manipulator as an expert, a legitimate authority on the subject matter, and or a source of credible information. And what we found was that these sort of so-called manipulator experts hold views that are inconsistent with established knowledge. They generally refuse to engage in scholarly debates, especially with regard to topics that are, central to their analysis, such as difficulties involved in defining extremism, et cetera. And they generally subscribe to kind of theories of radicalization that have little empirical support, but that connect Islamic religious conservatism with extremism in ways that are, just not accepted in scholarly and even government circles. Also, one of the big main strategies that they're involved in is the creation of conditions that facilitate false corroboration. In other words, by creating this content and syndicating it across a wide variety of media spaces, or having their sort of co-generators also republish their content, it creates a sense for a non-expert audience that there are multiple sources of whatever accusation they're making, and therefore it sort of validates or, quote unquote, verifies the information for a non-expert audience. And these non-expert audiences can include, just regular people or, congressional staff, people who don't really know much about these spaces. And so the ultimate, output here is that they flood the information environment with this sort of disinformation and misinformation. And this is sort of involves, a variety of sort of strategies, including sort of boosting information by search engine optimization, right? So they want to boost information that's kind of supports their sort of political angle, and then suppress any source of information that challenge the kind of manipulated information that they're producing. So I wanted to give you a couple of sort of more concrete examples of the techniques that they use, the generators use to demonstrate how this operates. Cherry picking is a very common technique that's rife in the space. So the paragraph I have on the slide is a narrative that appeared on a generator website and was syndicated through various media spaces, but interestingly was also repeated almost verbatim by an individual that we identified as a legitimator who provided a written submission to a hearing on Capitol Hill. So I've changed the names to not sort of contribute to the disinformation, but let me just read the paragraph and then I'll quickly dissect it. Before founding ABC Foundation in 2001, Alex worked for the Charitable International Foundation, CIF. The Treasury Department designated CIF and related entities as terror financiers in 2002. The Illinois-based CIF and its director, Thomas, were charged the same year with misusing charitable contributions to support al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups overseas. So the implication here is that Alex and ABC Foundation, a prominent US Muslim-led humanitarian relief organization and a going concern, are implicated in financing terrorism and are somehow connected to al-Qaeda. However, our analysis of this narrative quickly revealed that the DOJ had in fact dropped its case against CIF in 2002, and Thomas was ultimately cleared of the US courts of any connection to terrorism. So this entire sort of narrative falls apart if there's no substantive evidence to support Thomas being connected to, making charitable contributions to terrorism, right? At the time of this court case, the judge involved told prosecutors that they completely failed to connect the dots, and that's a quote, and that there was no evidence that Thomas had identified with or supported terrorism. Another technique that's rife in these narratives is guilt by association. So this involves spuriously connecting target organizations to a demonized group of people or a bad person to discredit them. And here's another narrative. So under the Biden administration, the most alarming grant is $50,000 from USAID to Helping Hand for Relief and Development, HHRD, one of the most dangerous Islamist charities in the United States. In 2017, HHRD openly partnered with the designated Pakistani terror group Lashkar-e-Taiba, which carried out the deadly 2008 Mumbai attacks in which 166 were murdered. So this narrative basically links the Biden administration to the murder of 166 people through various steps in the 2008 Mumbai attacks. Through a USAID grant to HHRD, which the narrative claims is openly partnered with Lashkar-e-Taiba. So the narrative entirely depends on the idea that HHRD openly partnered with Lashkar-e-Taiba in 2017, which in the report we deconstruct and find to be, at best misleading, but basically deceptive and untrue. So if there's no such link between HHRD and Lashkar-e-Taiba, then this entire narrative just completely falls apart, right? What's interesting is that this false assertion of an open partnership between HHRD and Lashkar-e-Taiba has appeared in an astonishing array of politically motivated attacks on a wide variety of organizations and individuals, including the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, USAID, Pakistan's then ambassador designate to the US, Masood Khan, Representative Ilhan Omar, local GOP officials in Michigan and Minnesota, and that's only just a sample. There were probably like 20 plus different targets that we identified that this false linkage between HHRD and Lashkar-e-Taiba was used to attack. And by virtue of including that false piece of information in all these different attacks, again, contributes to flooding the information environment and perpetuating the idea that this, the second largest US Muslim-led humanitarian organization is in fact somehow connected to terrorism, right? By the way, also I'll just add that there's no evidence HHRD, in our view, operates in any sense as an Islamist charity, doesn't identify as an Islamist charity. It primarily operates in Muslim majority countries, but it serves people regardless of their religion, ethnicity, or nationality, and basically can be seen as sort of analogous to Christian Aid or various sort of Christian faith-inspired organizations that generally sort of have a universalist view and sort of operate on the ground with sort of little room for religion. Another and final technique, and we have a whole range of different techniques that we talk about in the report, but I just chose a few here just to give you some concrete examples, is the appeal to false authority. This is where a generator supports his or her argument by citing a supposed authority figure or source that lacks expertise, credibility, or relevance to the subject matter. This may include self-citation, right, where they actually cite their own previous disinformation. So here, we have this, sentence. In 2015, Egyptian prosecutors accused Essam el-Haddad of using Islamic Relief to fund the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Bear in mind that Islamic Relief is a charity headquartered in the UK with global reach, is subject to regular audits by a variety of different domestic and international actors, including the UK Charity Commission. As you may know, the UK is an environment that is exceedingly more heavily regulated than charities would experience here in the US, right? And some analysts have noted that Islamic Relief, by virtue of the kinds of activities that I'm describing here, disinformation that's out there in the public realm, may in fact be the sort of the most audited charity in the global north, right? Anyway, just to talk about the appeal to false authority here, human rights NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have in various reports accused Egyptian prosecutors of engaging in political theater. And so I'll provide also an anecdote to illustrate this. And in 2014, Vodafone, a major European telecom company, ran an ad on Egyptian television that featured a puppet that babbled nonsensically at the audience. An Egyptian blogger, citing no evidence, suggested that the puppet may be communicating in code with Islamist groups. This blog post triggered a series of investigations of Vodafone by Egyptian prosecutors. So this is obviously anecdotal, but the idea remains, right, that this is not a credible authority. Once the cycle
Okay, I find this on the web for a series.
Sorry. Once the cycle of manipulated information has been become firmly established in the public sphere, i.e., once there are multiple seemingly independent sources reporting the false and misleading information, the generators move to bring it into the political realm. So they target like-minded or susceptible legislators. They play to biases, various political agendas, vulnerabilities. We're seeing this actually in real time right now with HHRD, who I mentioned earlier, where a reporter with the Washington Examiner is still perpetuating the false story that HHRD is openly partnered with Lashkar-e-Taiba. And this reporter in question is using this manipulated information to tar the Biden administration as being lax on terrorism, right? There is a talk now of a potential investigation involving various senators to launch an investigation into HHRD, even though we know that USAID vetted HHRD in August 2023 and cleared them to receive these grants. So, these cycles of manipulated information may trigger congressional hearings, investigations. When they occur, they are presented by the generators as further, quote unquote, evidence of malfeasance on the part of the targeted charity. And incidentally, these kinds of public hearings or investigations can also trigger bank de-risking, who may move to hinder the financial access of Muslim charities or even close their accounts as a way of sort of mitigating the bank's risk. And if this does happen again, it's presented by the generators as further evidence, quote unquote, of malfeasance on the part of the targeted charity. So on just the last couple of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about implications for funders. The generators operate as 501c3 organizations, which obviously allows them to receive tax-deductible donations. In all, we identified 269 funders that contributed a little over $30 million to the generators between 2016 and 2021. There are three broad categories of funders that we identified: family and private foundations, national DAF providers, and communal funds. We want to be sort of careful about how we interpret this data, acknowledging that the motivations, awareness, and processes surrounding this kind of philanthropic activity are multifaceted and often opaque. In some cases, when we calculated the percentage that a funder provided to the 5 generators as a percentage of the total funds that they dispersed over that time frame, this figure gave us a better idea as to whether or not the funder might know whether they're funding socially harmful activities, right? So if the amount of funds that they dispersed to the 5 generators constituted 40% of their charitable giving over that period of time, this is probably not a good actor, right? But in most cases, it was actually, these percentages were minuscule, right? As I say in the final point here, in many cases, funders are simply unaware of the negative impact these organizations have on public discourse, and in the particular case we were looking at, humanitarian aid. Also in section 4 of the report, we provide some recommendations for funders, and I'll just highlight 3 of them here. One of them is to undertake a closer assessment of the risks associated with unintentionally supporting groups that are involved in socially harmful activities. So this is sort of a matter of due diligence, right? To especially when it comes to kind of single issue or narrowly defined advocacy groups that are sort of operating more in the political realm. Another recommendation is to sort of take a engaged philanthropy approach. Again, to sort of embark on more community partnerships and local types of philanthropic giving, instead of kind of just acting as a pass-through to various sort of political advocacy groups that may sort of contribute to kind of polarization and sort of toxic political speech, etc. And finally, we recommend a sort of place-based giving position, where there's this sort of more focus geographically on local needs, community needs, and how to address them in partnership with community organizations. So thank you very much for your time. I hope the presentation was helpful and interesting. And please do feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about this research or its methodology, or any adjacent questions about any of the kind of techniques that we used in this type of research, which we think has sort of due diligence applications more generally in the sector. And with that, I'll hand back to Martha.